At approximately 3:10 in the morning, a father in Minnesota heard his 19-year-old son say 2 words into a phone. "Oh shit." Then the line went dead. Brandon Swanson had been talking to his father for almost 47 minutes while walking through dark farmland. He crossed fences, heard running water, and followed lights he believed would lead toward help. His parents were already searching for him. His phone worked. His father could hear him moving. Then Brandon disappeared. Neither he nor the phone has ever been found, and that call is only the beginning. In the California desert, a missing man's phone contacted a tower 3 days after he vanished. Searchers turned the signal into a mathematical radius and spent years trying to solve it. Nearly 12 years later, the man was found in the same desert, close enough to old search tracks to make the maps uncomfortable to look at. In Australia, another missing man's GPS trail stopped after midnight, but his phone kept being used. Ordinary data disappeared. Hours later, after sunrise, the phone came back onto the network before finally going silent for good. The device has never been recovered, and in Tasmania, a missing woman's phone was found more than 2 years after she disappeared. Inside Terrain Police said had already been extensively searched. "We now carry phones that remember movement, watches that record activity, and devices capable of reaching satellites where older technology would have been useless. Search teams have drones, thermal cameras, dogs, aircraft, and digital maps. A person should be harder to lose than at any point in history. Usually, that is true." The cases that follow begin with something tangible enough to mark on a map: a call, a tower contact, a location record, a recovered device, a timestamp. Then the trail reaches an edge, and beyond it the person keeps moving through a part of the story we can no longer see. Brandon Swanson had no reason to believe the night of May 14, 2008, was about to become a case people in Minnesota would still be studying years later. He had been visiting friends after finishing classes and was driving home toward Marshall. Rural roads spread across that part of the state in long, straight sections, broken by fields, drainage ditches, rivers, and small communities that can look deceptively simple in daylight. After midnight, the geometry becomes less forgiving. A road sign missed in the dark can put a driver miles from where he believes he is, and when the land around every intersection looks similar, confidence can survive long after orientation has failed. Brandon drove his car off a gravel road and became stuck in a ditch. The vehicle was not destroyed. There was no evidence that the incident had badly injured him. He had a phone, and at approximately 1:54 in the morning he called his parents and asked them to come help. Nothing about that call sounded like the beginning of a disappearance. It sounded like a problem with an obvious ending. His parents got into their car. Brandon told them where he believed he was, somewhere near Lind, and they drove toward him. They tried to coordinate with headlights. Brandon flashed his. His parents flashed theirs. Nobody saw anything. They drove roads that should have brought them close. Brandon described what he believed was around him. Again, nothing matched. At first, the mismatch still had innocent explanations. They could be around the next bend. Brandon could have given the wrong road name. His parents could have passed the turn, or a line of trees could be blocking the headlights. Every failed attempt added confusion without yet creating fear. Eventually, Brandon made the decision that would separate him from the one fixed object searchers could later locate with certainty. He left the car. He believed he could see lights in the distance. If he could walk toward them, he thought he could reach a place his parents would recognize. He stayed on the phone with his father as he moved through the dark countryside. This was not a weak signal that vanished immediately. The conversation continued for almost 47 minutes. 47 minutes changes the scale of the mystery. In that time, a person can cross property lines, leave one road system for another, descend toward water, climb out again, or follow a light that looks close and discover it is much farther away. For the person listening, every sound and description begins building a map that feels more reliable with each passing minute. Brandon mentioned fences. He crossed fields. At points, he said he could hear running water. He continued toward lights he believed would lead somewhere useful. His father heard him moving through a landscape that neither of them could correctly place. For all that time, the phone kept father and son connected while failing at the one thing they needed most. Neither knew where Brandon actually was. At approximately 3:10 in the morning, the conversation reached the moment repeated ever since. Brandon suddenly said those two words. "Oh shit." His father never heard his voice again. Calls back to Brandon were not answered. Accounts over the years have stated that the phone continued to ring for some period, a detail that has generated endless arguments about whether the device could have gone into water, remained on dry ground, or simply been beyond Brandon's reach. That detail is easy to overinterpret. What a caller hears does not provide a clean forensic description of the physical condition of a remote handset. But emotionally, it is almost impossible to ignore. His parents had been speaking with him moments earlier. Now the same number led nowhere. Daylight corrected the first major assumption. Brandon's car was found near Taunton, around 20 miles from the area where he had believed he was stranded. 20 miles. The number changes the entire previous conversation. The lights were no longer the lights his parents had imagined. The water was no longer necessarily the water they had imagined. Every fence, road, and direction Brandon described had to be moved onto a different landscape. Cellular information helped investigators shift attention toward the correct region. Searchers studied the roads and waterways. The Yellow Medicine River quickly became an obvious possibility because Brandon had mentioned hearing water and because a sudden fall could fit the abrupt end of the call. In the simplest reconstruction, he reaches a bank in darkness, steps where he expects solid ground, falls into water, and is unable to recover. It is a strong theory. It is not a recovered event. Search dogs complicated the picture. Accounts from the search describe dogs working scent toward areas near the river, and some searchers interpreted their behavior as suggesting the trail did not simply end at the water. Search teams returned to farmland, river corridors, and drainage areas. Law enforcement, fire departments, volunteers, and specialized canine teams were involved over the years. Large sections of the watershed were covered in one form or another. Nothing belonging to Brandon was recovered in a way that fixed his final location. No phone, no clothing, no jewelry, no remains. That absence does not make a river accident impossible. Rivers move things. Agricultural landscapes change. Water levels rise and fall. Vegetation grows. Private land complicates access. Search conditions are never perfect, but the missing physical endpoint means that every theory still has to cross a gap. The gap is exactly one action wide. What happened immediately after those final words? A fall fits. A sudden drop fits. A startled reaction to an animal fits. A vehicle or person appearing unexpectedly could fit. A medical event could fit. The final words are short enough to accept almost anything placed behind them, which is why the case has attracted so much speculation. Some theories stay close to the landscape and the known risks. Others move toward foul play, a chance encounter on private property, or an accident that someone later concealed. Still others move beyond anything that can be demonstrated and treat the abrupt silence itself as evidence of something inexplicable. The call never tells us which explanation deserves to win. It preserves only the edge of the event. Brandon's disappearance eventually helped inspire Brandon's Law in Minnesota, changing how missing adult reports can be handled when circumstances suggest danger. Procedure changed. Brandon did not come back. And the more carefully the final call is studied, the stranger one ordinary fact becomes. During those 47 minutes, Brandon was not disconnected from the world. He was speaking to it. Help was already moving toward him. The failure was not communication in the usual sense. It was location. His father could hear his son clearly enough to know he was walking, yet neither man knew where those footsteps were landing. A few years later, another family would face the opposite problem. They would know much more about the geometry of the final signal, but almost nothing about the human being producing it. William Bill Iwasko entered Joshua Tree National Park on June 24, 2010. He was 65, visiting from Georgia, and experienced enough outdoors that his disappearance did not immediately fit the stereotype of an unprepared visitor wandering away from a parking area. He had planned a series of hikes and left information about possible destinations. One of them was Quail Mountain, the highest point inside the park. Joshua Tree looks open until you try to search it. From a distance, the desert seems to reveal everything because there are no walls and comparatively few tall trees. On the ground, washes fold behind ridges, boulder fields create blind pockets, and small elevation changes erase lines of sight. Heat changes judgment. Distances flatten visually. A hill that appears close can require hours of travel through terrain that forces constant detours. When Bill failed to return, his rental car became the first fixed point. It was located at the Juniper Flats backcountry registration area. Searchers could now place him at the edge of a large wilderness and build probability outward from the hikes he had considered. More than 100 volunteers took part in the major official search effort. Teams worked on foot and horseback. Dogs were used. Aircraft flew. The National Park Service recorded more than 1,400 volunteer hours during the initial operation. Then, early on the morning of June 27th, the case acquired a number that would dominate the next decade. At approximately 6:50, a Verizon tower near Yucca Valley received a brief contact from Bill's phone. Technical information later compiled from the search indicated that the handset was estimated to be approximately 10.6 miles from the tower. The contact was short. The distance sounded precise, but there was no useful bearing. That means the number did not give searchers a point. It gave them a ring. Place a tower at the center of a map and draw a circle 10.6 miles away from it. Now imagine the sections of that circle crossing desert slopes, ridges, roads, park boundary, broken rock, and places where terrain changes how radio signals behave. The difference between a point and a ring is the difference between walking toward a person and walking into a problem. The ping was real evidence. 3 days after Bill disappeared, his phone communicated with the network. What it did not record was the scene around the phone. Was Bill holding it? Was it in his backpack? Had he turned it on after saving the battery? Had it been searching continuously for service until a brief opening in the terrain allowed contact? Was Bill moving when the network saw the device? Was he injured? Did he notice that service had appeared? Did he attempt a call that never connected? Had he climbed high, specifically to find a signal, or did the contact happen automatically while he was thinking about something completely different? Nothing in the tower record can answer those questions. The official search ended without finding him, but Bill's case did not become quiet. It attracted volunteers who began treating the disappearance like a problem that might still yield to enough mapping and enough time on the ground. The most persistent was Tom Mahood, a former search and rescue volunteer with an engineering mindset and an unusual willingness to publish his reasoning as he went. Mahood collected records from the original operation. He studied likely routes, water sources, topography, old trails, roads, and the cellular radius. He began walking possibilities and recording his own search tracks with GPS. Then he returned, and returned again. The public map of the search slowly filled with lines. One route crossed another. New searches covered gaps left by earlier searches. High-probability corridors were walked from different directions. The desert became a visible archive of effort. After enough trips, the psychology changes. At first, the blank spaces look promising because they have not been checked. Later, the searched spaces become disturbing because they have produced nothing. If Bill is not here, and not there, and not along the drainage everyone expected, then each negative search encourages the next theory. He could have tried to reach a road, suffered heat illness, become injured and moved into shade, or followed a feature that looked more useful on a map than it did on the ground. The 10.6-mile distance may have been treated too rigidly. The final ping may have belonged to a place nobody prioritized, or the entire mental model of his route may have been wrong. At one point, Mahood wrote that he was running out of reasonable ideas and beginning to run out of crazy ones. After years of negative searches, the remaining blank spaces stop feeling neutral. Each one begins to carry more weight than it should. Rumors also began attaching themselves to Bill's timeline. One repeated story claimed surveillance footage showed him buying water near Joshua Tree before the hike. Later review showed that the dramatic version was wrong. There was video of Bill buying supplies in Palm Desert, but the Joshua Tree water purchase had grown from misunderstanding into something people were already using to support theories. That detail matters because long disappearances collect false certainty. One line is repeated without its original source. A possibility becomes a reported fact. A reported fact becomes a clue. Then a theory is built on top of it and survives long after the foundation disappears. The phone contact was different. It remained stubbornly real. Searchers kept coming back to the landscape around it. On one of his trips, Mahood climbed a freestanding hill north of Samuelson's Rocks and scanned the surrounding country with binoculars. From that position, he could see across large portions of the terrain that had occupied the search: Quail Mountain, Smith Water Canyon, the country leading north. He sat above the desert and looked across a map that had been studied for years, trying to understand what had been missed. The answer was already out there. Nobody knew it. In February of 2022, hikers in Joshua Tree found human remains and personal belongings. A wallet carried Bill Iwasko's identification. The discovery ended the question of whether he had somehow left the region or begun another life. He had remained inside the same desert that had been searched and researched for almost 12 years. The recovery location created a second shock. When people involved in the independent searches compared it with earlier tracks, they realized that experienced searchers had come remarkably close. One route had passed within a few hundred yards of the place where Bill was eventually found. A few hundred yards is a large distance when you know exactly where an object is. It is almost nothing when you imagine years of people walking through an empty desert looking specifically for one human being. Mahood had stood on nearby terrain and scanned the country. Other searchers had crossed areas around it. Aircraft had flown. Maps had been filled with lines. Bill had been there while all of that happened. The case did not need a hidden cave, a secret road, or an impossible event to defeat the search. It needed angle, terrain, distance, and one place that never received exactly the right pair of eyes. Bill's recovery should make the story feel resolved. In one sense, it does. His family finally knew where he had been, but the phone contact still sits in the middle of the timeline like a signal from a scene nobody witnessed. At 6:50 on June 27th, the network saw his device. Bill would ultimately be found far from his vehicle, after a route nobody can reconstruct step by step. Somewhere between the ping and the recovery location, he made decisions that are now gone with him. The tower gave searchers 10.6 miles. It did not give them Bill. Bill Iwasko left searchers with a signal but no phone. More than a decade later, another disappearance would reverse that equation. The phone itself would come back, and when it did, it was lying inside ground people had already searched. That discovery did more than reopen one case. It changed the way old search maps had to be read. Celine Kremer was 31, a Belgian traveler moving through Tasmania in June of 2023. On June 17th, she was last confirmed alive in the small town of Waratah. Investigators believe she drove toward Philosopher Falls, a walking area surrounded by dense, wet forest in the northwest of the island. The setting is the opposite of Joshua Tree. Instead of dry washes and rock, the ground is crowded with ferns, moss, fallen timber, steep banks, mud, and water. Visibility can collapse within a few steps. A navigation application can draw a clean line through terrain that a human body cannot cross cleanly at all. Celine did not return. She was not reported missing until June 26th, 9 days after the last confirmed sighting. Her white Honda was found near the Philosopher Falls track. Searchers entered winter conditions. Tasmania Police, State Emergency Service volunteers, and specialist personnel worked the area. Aircraft and drones were used. Temperatures dropped. Rain, cold, and difficult terrain reduced the chance that someone exposed outdoors could survive long enough for rescue. The main operation eventually reduced without finding her. For more than 2 years, the case remained physically empty, except for the car. Then, investigators and private searchers began focusing more intensely on location information associated with Celine's phone and Google account. Reporting about the private investigation described multiple GPS points from the day she disappeared. The emerging reconstruction suggested that Celine may have left the established track and attempted to take a more direct route toward her car as daylight faded. On a screen, that is an understandable decision. 2 points appear separated by forest. The straight line is shorter. On the ground, the straight line may be the worst possible route. A dense Tasmanian forest can hide steep drops, thick scrub, streams, unstable banks, and river systems inside what looks like a simple distance. Every detour made to avoid one obstacle changes the direction of the next attempt. A person using a phone for orientation may look down, move toward a bearing, discover the terrain refuses it, move sideways, and then try again. The resulting track can look deliberate afterward, even if every segment was an attempt to correct the previous problem. A privately organized search returned to the area in December of 2025. Friends of Celine had traveled from Belgium. Volunteers moved through thick vegetation with the new digital information in mind. On December 13th, a searcher saw a mobile phone in the bush. Tasmania Police confirmed it belonged to Celine. The official statement contained the detail that changed the case instantly. The phone had been found in an area that had been extensively searched previously, not just close to it, inside it. The device was reportedly around 300 meters off the walking track, and contemporary reporting said it was found about 60 meters from one of the last recorded coordinate points used by the private team. For more than 2 years, the phone had existed as a physical object inside a search landscape while Celine remained missing. Think about the size of a phone against wet leaves, soil, ferns, and shadow. Its color may be visible from one angle and disappear from another. A searcher can pass on the wrong side of vegetation. Rain can push debris over it. New growth can change what is visible season to season. The phone had not traveled somewhere impossible. It had simply been missed. Police said the location of the device and the phone data supported the working theory that Celine may have left the Philosopher Falls track in an attempt to take a more direct route back toward the car as daylight faded. But finding the phone opened a new gap instead of closing the old one. Where was Celine when the phone stopped moving with her? The phone could have slipped from a pocket, fallen from her hand in a stumble, or been set down for a moment and never recovered. Celine might have noticed the loss and tried to backtrack, or continued without realizing the device was gone. Every version leaves the same missing instant between woman and phone. The device fixed one point in space, but not the moment Celine separated from it. Searches intensified around the new evidence. Additional objects were found. Then, in late January of 2026, human remains were discovered in the broader Philosopher Falls area. More bones, clothing, and personal items followed during operations along the Arthur River. A Honda car key recovered during the search was verified as Celine's. In February, Tasmania Police said expert reports provided compelling evidence that the remains were Celine, subject to the formal coronial process. The recovered device pulled searchers back into the landscape. The remains finally gave the family the answer they had been seeking for years. The sequence between leaving the track, losing the phone, and reaching the place where she died can only be reconstructed. The digital path records movement, not Celine's state of mind. It cannot tell us whether she still felt confident, whether she knew she was lost, or when a route that looked shorter on the screen began to feel dangerous on the ground. And it does not explain how the phone remained undiscovered in previously searched ground for more than 2 years. That single fact has consequences far beyond Celine's case. Whenever somebody says Cian's red phone would have been found if it were near a searched route, Celine's phone exists as a warning. Whenever somebody argues that a backpack cannot remain near a trail after repeated searches, Bill Iwasco exists as a warning. Whenever an unresolved mountain case is declared impossible because helicopters flew overhead, the Shannon Falls search and the later recovery there, along with the Julian Sands case, exist as warnings about what aerial coverage can still miss. The ground does not have to do anything extraordinary to keep an object. Sometimes, we simply fail to see it. Celine Cremer's phone spent more than 2 years hidden in vegetation before it was seen. Theo Hayes left a different kind of digital ghost. His phone was never recovered, but for several hours on the night he disappeared, it kept leaving a trail detailed enough to reconstruct where the device moved, what applications were used, and when the connection changed. The closer investigators got to the final minutes, the less satisfying the picture became. Theo Hayes was 18 years old, from Belgium, and traveling in Australia when he disappeared in Byron Bay at the end of May 2019. On the night of May 31st, he went out with other travelers and entered a bar called Cheeky Monkeys. At around 11 that night, he was asked to leave. That was the last confirmed sighting of Theo by anyone who could place him with certainty. If the story ended there, investigators would have had a young tourist somewhere in a busy coastal town and very little else. But Theo was carrying a phone connected to a Google account, and the device kept building a silent map after the last human witness disappeared. The map immediately created a question. Theo checked directions connected with the hostel where he was staying, yet he moved in the opposite direction. Google data showed him walking away from the center of Byron Bay, stopping for roughly 7 minutes near Cricket Nets, then continuing through the dark Milne Track and bushland toward Tallow Beach. The route was not the obvious walk back to his accommodation. It took him toward the coast, toward a strip of beach beneath the Cape Byron headland, where the land rises sharply above the ocean. The phone reached an area known as Cozy Corner at the northern end of Tallow Beach. At approximately 12:05 in the morning on June 1st, the last available GPS data placed the device there. That sounds like the moment the digital trail ended. It was not. The phone continued to show user activity for almost another hour. Records examined during the coronial investigation showed Theo accessing online content and exchanging messages with friends and family. The messages were not panicked. They did not announce that he was lost. There was no obvious farewell. The device behaved like a phone still in the hands of someone awake and using it. Then, at approximately 1:02 in the morning, the phone stopped receiving ordinary data connectivity. Investigators later spent enormous effort trying to understand what that meant. Loss of data can happen because of terrain, signal conditions, settings, battery behavior, or the way a device changes its connection to the network. The temptation is to treat one timestamp as the moment something happened to Theo. The records do not allow that certainty. Then the phone came back. At approximately 6:17 that morning, hours after the earlier loss of data, it began receiving network data again. Cellular evidence was consistent with the device remaining around the headland area north of Cozy Corner. The phone stayed connected intermittently until approximately 1:47 in the afternoon, when it disconnected from the network permanently. That sequence became especially difficult to explain. If Theo suffered an accident shortly after 1 in the morning, what explains a device returning to the network after sunrise? If he was still with the phone when it reconnected, what happened during the hours in between? If he was not with it, when did the separation occur? Telecommunications evidence could describe behavior of the handset, but it could not show a person standing beside it. Investigators tested the terrain. They walked routes. They compared connections made by other phones. Experts examined how the topography around Cape Byron could affect cellular records. Evidence presented at the inquest supported the view that Theo's phone moved away from the beach and toward the headland after the final GPS point, but the terrain made precise interpretation difficult. The phone never produced a perfect camera angle on the missing event. The physical setting offered an obvious danger. The headland above Cozy Corner is steep, with unstable ground and cliffs above the sea. Police considered accidental death a serious possibility. A fall followed by the ocean carrying the body away could explain why no remains were recovered. But the phone complicated a simple version of that theory. Experts told the inquest that the later network activity was not consistent with a handset already submerged in seawater. That does not prove Theo never entered the ocean. It creates a timing problem. If the device was still functioning on land hours later, then whatever happened to Theo may not fit neatly into the first moment when the digital record changed. The family also questioned whether Theo was alone. His route through dark, secluded bushland seemed unusual to people who knew him. Investigators examined the possibility that another person had been with him. Digital techniques were used in an attempt to identify other devices in key areas, but the available methods had limitations and could not account for every possible phone. No confirmed companion was established. The coroner ultimately found that Theo was likely dead and had likely died in or near Byron Bay during the period of his disappearance, but the evidence was insufficient to determine whether he died by accidental misadventure or whether another person was involved. The phone has never been found. Celine's phone eventually returned and gave searchers a new physical point. Theo's never did. His device left an unusually detailed trail, kept communicating after the GPS record stopped, then disappeared with him. Investigators could reconstruct portions of its behavior almost minute by minute, yet the event that would explain the night still falls between records. They could see where the handset had been without learning why Theo went there, whether he was alone, or what happened before the final disconnection. Theo's case contained a map detailed enough to feel invasive and still not enough to close the final hour. Shin McLaughlin would disappear in a place with a different kind of visibility. There were cameras, witnesses, a parked vehicle, internet history, a phone, a watch, aircraft, and thermal imaging. Then one human statement entered the search and bent the entire map. On June 8, 2021, 27-year-old Cian entered Grand Teton National Park. Cameras recorded him entering through the moose area at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. Around 15 minutes later, a friend encountered him on the Lupine Meadows trail system. He was wearing a white shirt and carried several items that would later become important to searchers, including a red iPhone 12 mini and a red Apple Watch. Those objects sound almost designed to resist disappearance. A bright phone, a connected watch, a national park trailhead. Daylight. Other hikers nearby. But Cian had not left a confirmed route plan. From Lupine Meadows, the landscape opens toward several very different destinations. Garnet Canyon leads into dramatic mountain terrain. Surprise Lake and Amphitheater Lake climb higher. Delta Lake sits below the Tetons in a basin reached by a route that draws hikers away from the simplest maintained trail. One digital detail later became particularly important. Computer forensics showed that Cian had searched online for information related to Delta Lake before the hike. That looked like intent. It was not proof of movement. Witness reports added more pieces. A credible early sighting placed a man matching Cian on the trail system toward Garnet Canyon. Other hikers offered information that seemed to narrow the route. Then, Cian failed to appear at work. The missing person report reached authorities days later, and on June 13th, park staff found his vehicle at Lupine Meadows. The search that followed was not small. At points, as many as 70 park personnel per day were involved. Search and rescue dog teams worked backcountry routes. Technical searchers entered steep ground with ropes, crampons, and ice axes. The Civil Air Patrol used forward-looking infrared equipment. Teton County Search and Rescue brought RECO technology, equipment capable of detecting certain reflectors and sometimes electronic devices under the right conditions. More than 45 helicopter search missions were flown. Investigators contacted or interviewed more than 140 people as they tried to turn the last known movements into a route. There was also reported cellular information associated with Cian's phone, adding another geographic clue to a case already crowded with them. On paper, the search was loaded with advantages. A camera at the entrance, a vehicle at a known trailhead, a friend who saw him, possible later witnesses, search history related to Delta Lake, a red phone, a red watch, cellular information, dogs, thermal imaging, and helicopters. It is difficult to imagine a modern search beginning with much more. Then a woman came forward and said she had seen him somewhere else. Her account was detailed. She placed Cian on the south side of the Bradley-Taggart Moraine, moving toward Taggart Lake. If true, it shifted probability away from the areas searchers had been emphasizing. Resources followed the information. The sighting was false. Investigators later determined that the woman had fabricated the encounter. She admitted she had never seen Cian. According to the National Park Service, the false report consumed approximately 532 hours of search, management, and investigative work. She was ordered to pay restitution and banned from Grand Teton National Park for 5 years. 532 hours is not just a number on a court document. In a wilderness search, time changes the ground. Snow melts, weather moves in, trails collect new footprints and scent weakens. Witnesses lose confidence in dates. A route that was reachable one afternoon can become dangerous the next morning. A believable false witness does more than add a bad clue. It distorts the good clues around it. Once the fabricated report was removed, Investigators again had to look at the earlier evidence, the Lupine Meadows trailhead, the credible sightings toward Garnet Canyon, the search history focused on Delta Lake, the phone information. All of it pointed toward real places, but none of it produced a final place. Searchers asked backcountry visitors to watch for Cian's red phone, red watch, sunglasses, pendant, and clothing. Those objects are small enough to vanish in mountains and distinctive enough that one of them could end the case if found in the right location. None has been publicly recovered. More than 45 helicopter missions sounds like saturation. Thermal imaging suggests sight beyond ordinary human limits, and search dogs add another sensory system. Yet each tool still depends on terrain, timing, and conditions. Thermal cameras do not see through solid rock. Vegetation interferes. A person in cold terrain does not remain a bright heat source forever. Reco requires the right geometry and detectable material. Dogs work probability, scent, and terrain, not certainty. Helicopters see surfaces and openings while a mountain is full of spaces that do not face the sky. The scale of the operation proves how hard people looked, not that every hidden place gave up what it contained. There is a subtler trap in Cian's case. A browser search feels personal enough to become intent. Someone looks up Delta Lake, then disappears from the trail system leading toward it, and the mind draws a straight line between the two. The line may be right. He may have intended the lake, reached it, or changed his mind at a junction. The search may also have been nothing more than curiosity. The same problem affects a phone record. A cellular contact is evidence that a device interacted with a network. Unless the underlying data provide precise coordinates, it is not a camera showing the owner standing on one exact patch of ground. Mountain terrain can make one tower visible while another closer tower is blocked. A phone can connect on a ridge and then disappear from the network minutes later when its owner descends. If Cian's red iPhone is eventually found, the first question will be where. The second will be whether Cian was still carrying it when it reached that place. That uncertainty has left room for years of speculation. Hidden falls, unsearched cliff systems, an unexpected route change, an encounter with another person. Online discussions have questioned whether rejected sightings deserved more attention, whether the phone data have been simplified too aggressively, and whether a search this large can fail for reasons nobody has modeled correctly. Other theories go much farther, because once a red phone, a red watch, and a human being all disappear inside heavily searched terrain, the empty space will accept almost anything. The hard record refuses to choose for us. Cian entered the park. Cameras saw him. A friend saw him. Other people may have seen him farther up the trail. His computer history showed interest in Delta Lake. His vehicle stayed behind. Searchers attacked the terrain with tools far beyond what had been available in older wilderness cases. Then the trail went blank. Cian's case shows how too many clues can pull a search apart. Geraldine Larguet's disappearance shows the opposite. The missing person knew exactly what had happened, wrote it down in the device in her hand, and tried to send it out. The answer existed while searchers were looking for her. They simply could not receive it. Geraldine Larguet was 66 when she was hiking the Appalachian Trail through Maine in July of 2013. Her trail name was Inchworm. She had been on the route for months, and her husband George supported the hike by meeting her at planned points. There was a schedule. There were expected rendezvous. Geraldine carried a phone and communicated as she moved north. On July 22nd, she stepped away from the trail to use the bathroom. Then, she could not find the trail again. It is difficult to accept how small the beginning of a fatal event can be. There was no storm ripping trees down at the moment she became lost. No dramatic injury announced the danger. She simply moved away from the marked corridor into dense Maine forest and failed to reconnect with it. The landscape around the Appalachian Trail can make a short distance feel enormous. In thick woods, the trail does not remain visible behind you for long. Trees repeat. The ground offers few long sight lines. A person who walks farther while trying to correct the mistake can turn a small error into a new starting point without realizing it. Geraldine had a phone. At approximately 11:01 that morning, she composed a text message to her husband explaining that she was in trouble, had left the trail and become lost. She asked him to contact people who could help. The message did not go through. The following afternoon, around 4:18, she tried again. She said she had been lost since the previous day and asked for police assistance. That message also failed. Geraldine was not confused about the basic problem. She knew why she had left the trail, knew she was lost, and knew she needed help. She put all of that into the device in her hand. The network never delivered that information, so from her husband's side, there was only silence. Years later, a missing person timeline can make those hours look empty because there is no successful call, no delivered text, and no new tower event. Geraldine's phone showed that an apparently blank timeline can contain a desperate conversation trapped inside the device. She tried to improve her situation. Reporting about the recovered evidence indicates she moved in an effort to obtain service and eventually established a camp. When she failed to arrive at the next planned meeting point, her husband reported her missing. The Maine Warden Service launched a major search. The area was enormous before searchers could reduce probability around sections of the Appalachian Trail. Wardens, volunteers, dogs, and aircraft became involved. Geraldine was still alive. While people outside tried to determine where she had gone, she kept a journal. The pages created a second timeline hidden inside the first. Search operations could end for the day while Geraldine continued living somewhere beyond the search line. A new morning could begin for rescuers while it also began for her. She waited. She wrote. She rationed what she had. Her final known journal entry was dated August 18th, weeks after she became lost. Investigators later noted uncertainty about whether every date could be treated as perfectly exact, but the recovered record made one fact clear. Geraldine survived far longer than anyone outside the forest knew. Before the final entry, she wrote a note intended for whoever might someday find her body. She asked that her husband and daughter be contacted and that her belongings be returned to them. By then, she understood something the searchers did not. The rescue might never reach her. More than 2 years passed before a forestry worker surveying land connected with a military training area discovered Geraldine's campsite and remains in October of 2015. Her tent had collapsed. Her belongings were still there. The phone was recovered. Investigators extracted the failed messages. The location was roughly 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. 2 miles is almost nothing when driving. In dense forest, without a known direction, and without a successful signal, it can be larger than a search operation. The medical examiner concluded that Geraldine died from starvation and exposure. Her disappearance was no longer mysterious in the basic sense. Investigators knew she had stepped away from the trail, become lost, tried to contact her husband, and survived for an extended period in one area. But imagine the same case without the recovery. No phone means no failed messages. No journal means no explanation for leaving the trail. No camp means no proof that she remained alive while people searched. The public record would show an experienced, long-distance hiker who somehow disappeared near a famous marked trail despite a major operation. People would argue about whether she could really have become lost so close to the route. Some would insist another person must have been involved. Others would point toward animals, hidden terrain, or an intentional disappearance. The stranger theories would arrive because they always arrive when the physical endpoint does not. And all the while, the actual explanation would have been sitting inside a dead phone. That should change the way any unresolved missing phone is imagined. Cian McLaughlin's red iPhone may contain nothing useful beyond what investigators already know. Or it may contain photographs, route searches, health data, or cached locations that cannot be recovered because the device itself is missing. Matthew Green's camera and phone may hold the final mountain he photographed. Chris Fowler's phone may prove that the charger problem ended his communication exactly when everyone assumed it did, or it may show later activity nobody can access without the handset. The absence of remote data is not proof that no data existed locally. Geraldine's case proves something else. A missing person does not need to be moving wildly through wilderness to remain hidden. For a significant portion of her ordeal, she was waiting. Search models try to predict movement by asking how far a person could travel, whether they would climb or descend, follow water, or return toward the last known point. But exhaustion, fear, or the belief that rescuers are coming can make someone stop. Once the missing person becomes stationary, the search problem changes completely. A stationary person should be easier to find. Geraldine was not. Geraldine's phone eventually returned with her story trapped inside it. In Nevada, another phone was recovered without the person who had carried it, and because of where it was found, the empty space around that device grew into a wilderness legend that has persisted online for years. Kenneth Kenny Veach was 47 when he disappeared in November of 2014. The official Las Vegas Metropolitan Police record is extremely short compared with the legend that later formed around him. It says he was last seen in Las Vegas on November 10th, called his former girlfriend and told her he was going camping, then was never seen or heard from again. Those are the bare facts. The story that made Kenny famous had already begun online before he disappeared. He spent time exploring remote desert country north of Las Vegas, in a region where empty roads, military land, abandoned mines, and long rocky ranges have generated stories for generations. In an online discussion, Kenny described encountering a cave entrance that he said resembled a capital M. According to his own account, approaching the opening produced an intense physical sensation that frightened him enough to leave. The claim was never independently verified. Nobody produced a confirmed set of coordinates. Nobody documented the cave with Kenny standing beside it. No geological survey identified a location that matched every later description. What existed was his story, told on the internet, and the reaction of people who challenged him to go back. Kenny did return to the desert with a camera. He uploaded a video of one attempt to relocate the cave. The footage showed him moving through rough Nevada terrain and talking about the search, but he did not find the M-shaped entrance on camera. If he had come home from every later trip, the video would probably have remained a small piece of desert folklore. He did not come home from the next one. That changed the meaning of everything he had said before. Searchers located Kenny's vehicle in the general desert region connected with his trip. Volunteers from Red Rock Search and Rescue entered the surrounding terrain. Then they found his cell phone near a steep abandoned mine shaft. The phone and the shaft were real. Kenny was not there. A search and rescue commander told local media that the device gave teams a point they could work from, but no clear continuing trail beyond it produced Kenny. The mine feature and surrounding area were checked. The desert beyond remained enormous. From that point, two stories grew around the same phone. In the grounded version, it is a physical clue in a difficult desert search. Kenny could have dropped it, left it deliberately, or moved beyond it into terrain where searchers could not establish a usable trail. People close to him later discussed personal circumstances that offered explanations unrelated to the cave legend. In this version, the phone matters because it marks the last known separation between Kenny and the object most capable of keeping him connected. The second version begins with the M cave. Online, the phone near the mine became part of a much larger mythology. People searched satellite imagery for M-shaped openings. Some linked the story to the proximity of military ranges. Others claimed unusual vibrations, concealed entrances, altered rock faces, or secret underground facilities. Videos appeared announcing possible locations. Other videos debunked those locations. One person would identify a dark shape on a mountain, and another would show that it was a shadow, a normal mine opening, or a formation nowhere near Kenny's likely route. The stranger the story became, the less new evidence it needed. Unresolved disappearances often work that way. A theory can grow simply because nothing arrives to kill it. If searchers had found Kenny 2 days later after a fatal fall, the M cave would have become an odd detail in his internet history. Because he remained missing, the cave became a possible destination, then a possible cause, then for some people, almost a character in the story. The M cave was never independently verified, and neither were the later claims about hidden facilities, sealed entrances, or altered rock. They remain part of the legend rather than established evidence. But the legend grew around a physical problem that never went away. Kenny told someone he was going camping. His vehicle was later located in remote desert country. His phone was found near an abandoned mine shaft. Searchers did not find him. Why was the phone there? A phone recovered without its owner creates a completely different kind of last ping. With Brandon Swanson, the device vanished with the person. With Matthew Green, the missing phone remains a possible archive of the final day. With Celine Kremer, the device was found years later and helped redirect the search toward remains. Kenny's phone was recovered while the owner remained absent. The device had reached an endpoint. Kenny had not. A deliberate choice to leave the phone would mean one thing. Losing it without noticing would mean another. An accident at the same moment could place the device close to the answer, while a healthy Kenny walking away from it could make the phone almost irrelevant to his final location. The distance between phone and person after separation can be 10 feet or 10 miles. That uncertainty is why a found device can sometimes make a case larger instead of smaller. Searchers finally have an object they can touch, but the object does not say whether it was abandoned before the decisive event or because of it. Kenny's case became famous because the last physical clue sat next to a landscape already loaded with underground stories. But the most disturbing version does not require any of them. A man walked into the desert. His phone came back. He did not. Kenny Veach left a phone behind, and a legend grew around the place where it appeared. Chris Fowler left no phone at all. His final message did something more dangerous. It gave everyone a perfectly ordinary reason to expect that the phone was about to go silent. On the Pacific Crest Trail, Chris used the trail name Sherpa. He was 34 and no longer moving like someone discovering long-distance hiking for the first time. Months on the trail had taught him weather, resupply, pain, navigation, and the rhythm of making decisions while tired. Other hikers described him as strong. When he wanted to move fast, he could cover around 25 miles in a day. One person remembered how well he moved through snow. He also liked photography. That small detail matters because Chris was willing to leave the obvious line of the trail for views and photographs. A hiker who remains on a corridor is easier to model than a hiker who treats the corridor as a base from which to explore. Chris had an agreement with his family to check in periodically, roughly every 2 weeks. He kept that routine. On September 30th, he spoke with his stepmother and said he still intended to reach Canada. On October 12th, he was dropped near White Pass and continued north. He was still in contact with a woman he had hiked with earlier in the trip. That day, Chris sent her a message explaining that he was having trouble with his phone and was trying to get a new charger. Around 5 in the afternoon, his phone made its last known cellular contact in the White Pass area. Then there was silence, and at first the silence looked ordinary because Chris had already explained it. His phone was failing. A missed message or call fit the charger problem perfectly, so the first absence of contact reinforced the harmless explanation instead of challenging it. That harmless explanation bought the disappearance time. Another week passed before concern hardened into something more serious. His family checked resupply points and contacted authorities. By October 23rd, the situation no longer looked like ordinary trail silence. By the end of the month, Chris was formally listed as missing, and a search involving multiple counties developed. But the Cascades had already changed. Weather around the period of his disappearance brought heavy rain and snow. A trail visible under autumn conditions can become a different object after a storm. Snow covers tracks. Rain destroys scent. Wind moves debris and changes where a lost person can shelter. Streams become more dangerous. A side route that looked harmless when Chris entered it may be impossible for a search team days later. The official operation extended across 5 counties and continued for roughly 2 weeks before worsening conditions forced it to end. Chris's family traveled from Ohio and followed leads. Volunteers returned in later seasons. The foundation eventually created in the names of Chris Fowler and David O'Sullivan has continued to treat his case as active and unresolved. No confirmed remains, phone, final campsite, or piece of gear has ever fixed the place where Chris stopped moving. The last known cellular contact remains near White Pass at around 5 in the afternoon, but a strong hiker can put miles between a phone ping and a night's campsite. If Chris still had enough power to use the phone when it connected, he could have continued walking afterward. If he found a charger, the phone may have returned to life without producing a public clue investigators could later use. If the device failed exactly as he warned, then the last ping may tell us almost nothing about the place where his trouble began. The weather offers an obvious explanation. Exposure can kill an expert. Hypothermia does not care how far someone has already walked. A tree limb, fall, river crossing, or ordinary bad step can end movement in seconds. Chris's photography habit pulls the map sideways. A brief detour for a ridge view could carry him only a few hundred feet from the Pacific Crest Trail and still make him invisible to everyone who later stayed on the corridor. Seeking shelter from a storm or descending away from snow could send him into a completely different drainage. The most unsettling detail is not dramatic at all. Chris did not send a message saying something was following him. He did not report a strange encounter. He did not say he was lost. He said his phone was giving him trouble. Then the phone stopped speaking for him. When a final message predicts silence so perfectly, it becomes easy to mistake silence for evidence that nothing else happened. In reality, Chris may have lived through hours or days after the last cellular contact. The phone marks the point where the record failed, not the point where the person necessarily did. Chris disappeared on a trail that gave searchers a long corridor to work from. Matthew Green disappeared with no confirmed final trailhead at all, and his experience made the search area expand instead of contract. In July of 2013, Matthew was in the Eastern Sierra around Mammoth Lakes. He had been climbing with friends, but his Subaru developed a blown head gasket. His partners eventually had to continue their own travel, leaving Matthew in Mammoth while the car was repaired. He stayed at New Shady Rest Campground and continued going into the mountains. The broken car should have created a fixed schedule. Matthew was waiting for it. The repair shop expected him to come back. Friends expected him to continue toward Colorado afterward. The vehicle was repaired. Matthew never collected it. His campsite remained behind with equipment that suggested he had not intended to vanish into the backcountry for an extended expedition. He had left his tent, sleeping setup, and other possessions. At the same time, important climbing gear was missing with him. Reports describe a large backpack, mountaineering boots, crampons, an ice axe, camera, wallet, and phone. One object left at camp generated years of attention. A climbing guidebook had a section removed. Matthew was known to tear pages out for areas he planned to use and later put them back with notes. The missing material covered the minarets and nearby mountain country, including terrain around Mount Ritter, Banner Peak, and the June Lake region. From a desk, the missing pages looked like the answer. Matthew had already been climbing in the area, though, so they could point to his final objective. An earlier climb, several possibilities, or simply an old habit. A clue can be genuine and still belong to the wrong day. His phone created another uncertain boundary. Official California records continue to list Matthew as missing from Mammoth Lakes. Reporting and case reconstructions have described the last phone activity as placing the device somewhere in the broad vicinity of the Ansel Adams Wilderness and have discussed cellular contact associated with Mammoth Mountain. The limitation matters more than the label. There is no perfect breadcrumb trail from his campsite to one cliff. In mountain terrain, a final cellular contact may happen before the most important movement. A climber can leave town, reach a high point where service briefly returns, then descend into country where the phone will remain silent for the rest of the day. If the device is switched off to conserve power, the last ping may mark a decision about battery rather than a place of danger. If the phone dies naturally, the final network event could be hours before anything goes wrong. Matthew's case had another problem that no technology could repair after the fact: delay. He was independent, traveling alone, and known to spend long days climbing. Silence was not automatically alarming. The campground host noticed he had not returned, and people around him became concerned, but the formal missing person response developed after precious time had already passed. By the time the scale of the problem was clear, the final day was no longer fresh. 2 weeks can erase an enormous amount of mountain evidence. A boot print becomes one among hundreds. Shuttle drivers carry new passengers. A stranger who offered a ride forgets which day it happened. Snowfields shift and streams change. A climber may remember Matthew's face but not the date, or the date but not the exact trail. And nobody knew Matthew's destination. That single fact widened the Sierra beyond any reasonable search box. Without his car, he could have used local shuttles, walked, accepted a ride, or hitchhiked. Once delivered to a trailhead, he could cover distance quickly. His experience allowed him to enter technical terrain casual hikers would avoid. The same skill that made him less likely to make a beginner's error made him capable of disappearing into places beginner behavior models would never prioritize. Searchers and volunteers tried to reconstruct his route from his habits, the torn guidebook pages, the equipment he took, the climbs he had already completed, the peaks that might interest him. Summit registers were checked. Climbers were asked whether they had seen him or found gear. Searchers entered parts of the Minarets and Ritter Range. Dean Rosnow, a former search and rescue member, spent extensive time searching possible routes. Matthew's father came west and walked hundreds of miles looking for his son. The effort created false hope more than once. Glasses found near Inyo craters were examined because Matthew had poor vision and wore glasses. They did not match his prescription. Other equipment discovered in the mountains attracted attention and then failed to connect to him. Each object briefly became a possible endpoint before turning back into someone else's lost gear. A backpack in a room is large. A backpack in the Sierra is nothing. From the air, a dark object can be rock. From a trail, clothing can disappear behind a single granite block. At the bottom of a chute, a person can be hidden from hikers passing only a short distance above. Snow can cover evidence and then move it. Rockfall can bury it. Brush can grow around it. Those realities keep an accident high on the list without choosing a location. The Minarets, Ritter, Banner, another trailhead, or even a ride toward Yosemite can all be made to fit. So can a less ambitious day close to Mammoth that was overlooked because Matthew's abilities pushed everyone to look farther and higher. Searchers know a great deal about what Matthew was capable of, and almost nothing about what he actually decided to do that day. His repaired Subaru waited at the shop. His camp waited. Friends expected him. His possessions formed a negative image of a man who planned to return. Yet no confirmed phone, camera, backpack, boots, or remains have closed the final route. The California Missing Person Database still lists Matthew Green. His problem was too many possible mountains. Kyle Britton's looked almost cleaner. His car, intended route, and reported phone area all seemed to line up inside one Hawaiian valley. That apparent simplicity did not produce him. Waipio Valley on the Big Island of Hawaii falls from the uplands toward the ocean through steep green walls, waterfalls, streams, and tropical vegetation. On August 30th, 2019, 27-year-old Kyle told family members he planned to hike in the valley, using the transverse route commonly called the Z Trail toward Waimanu Valley. His father described him as someone who had been hiking since childhood, although this was his first time attempting that specific solo route. Kyle was seen near the Waipio Valley Lookout in the morning. His vehicle was found there the same day. Kyle was not. The search began with the route he had described. Police and fire personnel, family members, friends and volunteers moved into Waipio and Waimanu. Helicopters searched from above. Dogs and drones were brought into later efforts. Volunteers dealt with steep, off-camber ground and tropical conditions that could make a route slow even when the distance on a map looked manageable. Then, cell data appeared to provide a sharper point. Reporting during the active search said investigators were able to map Kyle's final phone activity from the tower serving the area. His father said the last ping was around noon. Search reporting placed the final phone area around the upper portion of the Z Trail. A car at the lookout, a declared route, and a final phone area on that route create enormous confidence. The natural response is to search the line between them and then push farther along the same direction. Teams did exactly that. Searchers covered Waipio, the Z Trail, the plateau toward Waimanu, and areas connected with the intended hike. More than 100 volunteers were reported during periods of the search. Canine teams became involved. Aerial resources continued. Family members remained on the island and pushed the operation long after the first official efforts were reduced. No confirmed trace of Kyle was found. His phone was not recovered. His backpack and clothing were not publicly recovered as the missing clue. His keys were reportedly not found in the parked vehicle, suggesting he carried them when he left. There is no physical object fixing the point where Kyle stopped moving. The environment offers many ordinary dangers. Waipio contains steep cliffs, water, dense vegetation, unstable ground, and places where a fall can take a person below the level of the route within seconds. Heavy rain can transform streams. Tropical growth can hide clothing and equipment. A body below a cliff or inside thick vegetation may be invisible from an aircraft even when the general location is correct. If Kyle remained near the Upper Z Trail, repeated searches should have had a chance to encounter something. If he continued toward Waimanu, the route must have broken somewhere. A turn away from the trail, a road, a ride, or a broader than assumed tower area would each redraw the search differently. None has produced a physical endpoint. The answer may simply be that the landscape won the visibility contest. Celine's phone remained in searched forest. Bill remained in searched desert. That makes it completely possible for Kyle and his equipment to remain somewhere people have already crossed. Kyle's final phone activity narrowed the map without closing it. The handset disappeared with him, leaving no physical device to show what happened after the network stopped seeing it. Kyle disappeared after entering a tropical valley. Ryan Stuka vanished after leaving a house in a ski resort and starting what should have been a short walk home. The landscape was smaller. The weather made it larger. Ryan was 20 years old in February of 2018 and was living and working at Sun Peaks Resort in British Columbia. In the early morning hours of February 17th, he had been at a gathering on Burfield Drive. At approximately 2:10 in the morning, witnesses saw him leave. His home was not a distant backcountry camp. He was expected to walk a short distance through the resort. He never arrived. Later that morning, he failed to show up for work. Friends began looking for him. The first assumption was not that a person had disappeared into an enormous mountain range. It was that a 20-year-old had left a party in a place where roads, staff housing, ski infrastructure, and other people were close by. The phone added one hard clue without giving searchers a place they could simply walk to. Information later released by Ryan's family indicated that at approximately 3 in the morning, almost an hour after he was last seen leaving the residence, his cell phone produced a tower ping placing the device somewhere within Sun Peaks. There was no precise coordinate. Somewhere within Sun Peaks is a very different statement from here. The ping matters because Ryan was supposed to be making a short trip home. If he walked directly, why was there still no confirmed arrival almost an hour after he left? If he changed direction, where did he go? If the phone remained somewhere in the resort, was Ryan still carrying it? The data did not show a route between the party and the final network contact. Search and rescue teams moved quickly. The setting created a problem that changes with the season. Snow can preserve a person, hide a person, and erase the shape of the ground at the same time. Banks created by plows can become walls. Ditches disappear. Trails look different. A dark jacket against shadowed snow can be visible from one angle and gone from another. Searchers use dogs, snowmobiles, snowshoes, avalanche probes, metal detectors, drones, infrared cameras, helicopters. Excavators were used in later efforts. When snow melted, the family and volunteers returned and searched ground that had been inaccessible or visually closed during winter. The result did not change. Ryan's phone was not recovered. His wallet, keys, and clothing were not found in a way that established a final point. His bank accounts, cellular activity, and social media showed no known activity that explained a voluntary departure. The resort itself continued supporting public appeals, and years later, his family was still returning to Sun Peaks to search. One detail made the early reconstruction even weaker. Cameras that might have captured parts of the resort were reported by the family as not operating at the time of Ryan's disappearance. The place felt observed because ski resorts are built environments. The specific night Ryan disappeared contained more blind space than people assumed. That blind space attracted theories almost immediately. Some focused on snow. Ryan may have become disoriented, fallen into terrain hidden beneath winter conditions, or entered an area where searchers could not see him until spring. Others wondered whether a vehicle was involved. A short walk inside a resort includes roads, parking areas, and people leaving a late gathering. An accidental collision followed by panic has been suggested online. So has an encounter with another person. None of those stories has produced a recovered object that confirms it. Questions also formed around the party itself. Did Ryan actually walk alone? accept a ride, or change plans after leaving? And how much precision has the 3 o'clock ping gained in later retellings compared with the underlying tower data? The solid part is smaller than the story around it. His phone was still associated with sun peaks around 3 in the morning, but investigators did not have an exact final step. Years of searching create a strange psychological pressure in a place like Sun Peaks. Every summer without a discovery makes the obvious ground feel less likely. Every winter returns snow to areas that have already been examined. The family learns the terrain in seasons. Searchers begin looking not only for a person, but for faded fabric, metal, a key, a phone casing, anything that does not belong. The missing object does not need to be large. Ryan's family continues to ask people to watch for a dark jacket, a cap, shoes, an iPhone, wallet, and Volkswagen keys. Any one of them could move the known endpoint from an entire resort to one patch of ground. Until then, the last phone information remains almost cruelly broad. The device was still associated with the resort everyone was searching. Where Ryan was within that same landscape is the part nobody has been able to answer. Christopher Sylvia left something almost as valuable as a digital trail. He made a plan to meet another person, then left survival gear beside the Pacific Crest Trail and never reached the future he had already arranged. Chris was 28 when he began a southbound section of the trail in Southern California in February of 2015. On February 16th, several days into the hike, he called a friend and asked to be picked up the following day near a Buddhist meditation center on Chihuahua Valley Road. The call created a future point. Tomorrow, this place. Pick me up. Chris never arrived. At first, his friend reportedly thought he may have changed plans and continued hiking. That is plausible on a long trail where mileage, rides, and camps change constantly. Then another hiker found gear laid out beside the Pacific Crest Trail near mile 127. Reports describe a backpack, sleeping bag, sleeping pad, and identification connected to Chris. The hiker photographed the items without knowing their owner was missing. That image changes the case immediately. A hiker who disappears with all his equipment can be anywhere. A hiker whose survival gear is sitting beside the trail seems as though he should be close. He was not. By the time the connection became clear, more time had passed. Search and rescue teams worked wilderness east of Palomar Mountain and the surrounding trail system. Chris was not found. Years later, volunteers located another clue showing that he had visited a hostel earlier in the journey, but it only confirmed part of the route he had already completed. The final call and the abandoned gear point in opposite directions. The call says Chris intended to return to civilization. The gear says that at some point he separated himself from equipment a hiker normally depends on. He could have stepped away expecting to return within minutes. Illness, confusion, or dehydration could have changed his behavior. He could have reached a road, accepted a ride, or moved beyond the narrow search corridor without his pack. Or the gear could mark the place where something happened that never left a second clue. The future had been arranged. Someone was supposed to meet him. The rendezvous remained empty. Chris had arranged a pickup and never reached it. Brandon Lawson did something more urgent. He called the police himself, yet minutes later, his brother and a deputy were standing beside his truck, while Brandon remained somewhere out in the darkness. Brandon Lawson was 26 when his truck ran out of fuel on United States Highway 277 near Bronte, Texas, in the early morning hours of August 9, 2013. He was not hiking a national park trail. He was on a rural highway, close enough to pavement that the case should have been easier than a disappearance deep in mountain terrain. Shortly before 1 in the morning, Brandon called 911 from his cell phone. The recording is difficult to understand. His speech is fast, parts of the call are distorted, and several phrases have been argued over for years. What is clear from official records is that Brandon indicated he was on the highway between Bronte and Abilene, that his truck had run out of gas and that he needed police. A deputy responded and found the truck partially in the roadway. Brandon was not beside it. At almost the same time, Brandon's brother Kyle arrived with fuel. The strange part is that Kyle and the deputy did not initially understand the scene in the same way Brandon appeared to understand it. Kyle knew Brandon had legal trouble and believed he might be avoiding law enforcement. The deputy was dealing with an abandoned vehicle and did not know where the driver had gone. Neither man had the clean picture viewers have years later, when every phone call has been placed on a timeline. Family accounts later described Brandon remaining in intermittent phone contact during this period. A detail repeated in many accounts is that he indicated he could see his brother and the activity around the truck, while the people beside the truck could not see him. The calls were unstable. Reception was poor. After approximately 1:19 in the morning, calls to Brandon's phone began going directly to voicemail. After that, the line went quiet. The physical landscape around the truck was open enough to feel searchable and complicated enough to hide a person. Fields, brush, private property, and the darkness beyond the road created a much larger environment than the strip of asphalt suggested. Searchers went into the area. Aircraft and thermal equipment were later used. The obvious question remained almost embarrassingly simple. If Brandon had been close enough to see the truck, where did he go before daylight? The 911 call made the case much stranger because nobody could agree on every word. Listeners heard different things inside the distortion. Some believed Brandon described another person. Others heard a collision, an attack, or someone being taken into the woods. Some claimed to hear an additional voice. The more the recording circulated online, the more interpretations appeared. The sheriff at the time publicly described the call as garbled and difficult to understand. That limitation is important. A distorted recording is almost perfect material for a mystery because the human brain wants to complete incomplete sound. Once a listener expects to hear a particular phrase, the phrase can become almost impossible not to hear. But the uncertainty of the audio does not erase the central fact. Brandon called police himself and asked for help. A deputy reached his abandoned truck within minutes. His brother reached the same place. Brandon was not recovered. For years, the case divided into competing versions. One focused on Brandon being under the influence and becoming disoriented in the dark. Another focused on the possibility that he was frightened by or fleeing from another person. Others wondered whether he had been injured, wandered onto private land, or succumbed to the environment in a place searches never properly reached. The recording allowed every theory to borrow a different sentence from the same call. Then, in early 2022, a volunteer search on private property near the area of Brandon's last known movements found clothing that appeared consistent with what he had been wearing. Authorities were contacted. Texas Rangers searched the area and located human remains nearby. The discovery came more than 8 years after the night beside the highway. By late 2024, Brandon's family said DNA testing had confirmed the remains were his. Yet the discovery answered location more easily than circumstance. The Texas Rangers continued to list Brandon Lawson in their cold case material as an unsolved homicide investigation. That ending should sound familiar by now. A man can remain close to the landscape where everyone expects him to be and still avoid recovery for years. But Brandon Lawson adds something else. The final call has been analyzed for years, yet the garbled words have never become a verified scene. The recording leaves several questions tangled together. What was Brandon looking at when he asked for police? And why was he away from the truck? If he really could see his brother, why could nobody beside the vehicle see him? The audio may contain part of the answer, but years of repeated listening may also have placed meaning into sounds that were never clear enough to carry it. The remains eventually answered where Brandon had ended up. They did not explain the moment that produced the call. The cases with no physical endpoint look different when placed beside people who were eventually found. Alexander Nguyen disappeared near Shannon Falls in British Columbia after his phone produced a recent location on the Sea to Summit Trail. More than 50 ground searchers became involved. Helicopters and drones worked the mountain. The active search was suspended after crews said the practical area had been thoroughly covered and the remaining terrain was too dangerous. Almost 10 months later, climbers found human remains in remote terrain in the same provincial park while formal identification work was still being completed. Julian Sands disappeared in winter conditions on Mount Baldy, while phone data indicated movement deeper into the mountain. Avalanche danger kept ground teams out of some areas, but helicopters continued searching. Months later, hikers found his remains. Josh Hall vanished in Colorado with his dog after his phone produced a location near the Devil's Thumb and Diamond Lake trail system. Searchers went in through snow and avalanche conditions. His dog later emerged alive miles away. Josh was found only after the mountain changed and the snow retreated. Paul Miller is an even harsher control. He left his phone behind before a short hike in Joshua Tree, so there was no electronic breadcrumb at all. His car and intended trail were known. Hundreds of people searched. Dogs and aircraft were used. More than 6,000 search hours accumulated. His remains were found more than a year later in the same broad trail environment. None of those recoveries tells us what happened to Cian, Matthew, Chris, Kyle, Kenny, Ryan, Chris, or Brandon Swanson. They destroy only one comfortable assumption. A search can be extensive and still leave something behind. The phrase last ping creates another false sense of precision because people use it for several different kinds of evidence. A true GPS coordinate may place a device in a relatively small area. A tower registration may only show which cellular infrastructure handled a connection. A sector may suggest direction. Some systems can estimate distance. An application may preserve detailed location history, or the useful record may exist only inside the missing handset. The second problem is simpler and easier to forget. The handset is not the person. Celine Kremer's phone was found after it had separated from her. Kenny Veach's phone was recovered while Kenny remained missing. A fall can send a phone down one slope and its owner down another. A device can drop from a pocket, remain in a backpack, be placed somewhere deliberately, or continue talking to a network after the person carrying it can no longer move. Once separation happens, perfect tracking of the phone becomes imperfect tracking of the human. Time creates the same problem. A final connection is not a final heartbeat. If a battery dies at 5 in the afternoon and the hiker keeps walking until midnight, 7 hours vanish from the digital record. Geraldine Largay survived for weeks after useful communication failed. Chris Fowler could have put miles between White Pass and whatever eventually happened to him. Matthew Green's final cellular activity may have occurred before the most important movement of his final day. Sometimes the technology works almost exactly as promised. In late August 2025, 69-year-old Thomas Casey failed to return from a hike near Juneau, Alaska. His phone was pinged to remote country between trail systems. Updated location information later narrowed the area further. Searchers found him off-trail near the west side of the Mendenhall Glacier. He had died from injuries believed to have followed a fall. The signal did not explain the accident, but it did something more basic and more valuable. It brought searchers to the person. Modern satellite messaging, emergency location services, and wearable devices are built around exactly that chain. A signal gives rescuers geography, and geography gives them a chance to reach the person. The disturbing cases are the ones where the chain breaks somewhere in the middle. Sometimes the break is obvious. No service, dead battery, a phone left behind. Sometimes it is subtler. Bill Iwasko's phone connects but gives a ring instead of a point. Geraldine writes the exact message rescuers need, but the network never receives it. Theo Hayes's GPS trail stops while the phone continues behaving in ways investigators can see, but cannot translate into a final scene. Celine's phone is found, but only after it has stopped traveling with her. Cian leaves cameras, witnesses, internet history, a phone, and a watch. Then one fabricated sighting bends hundreds of hours of search away from the earlier clues. Old cases often grow stranger online because technical uncertainty is the first thing to disappear. A tower contact becomes a precise dot, a search corridor becomes every inch was checked, a dog working near water becomes proof of a crossing, and a guidebook page becomes a declared destination. Eventually, theories begin solving contradictions created by the retelling rather than by the original event. Kenny Veach shows the opposite danger. His real phone was found near a real abandoned mine. Because his M-Cave story already existed, the missing ending gave every later rumor somewhere to attach. Secret entrances, military explanations, altered rock, and hidden tunnels did not need proof to survive. They needed only Kenny not to come back. The pattern is unsettling without any extra theory. The distance between a case that feels impossible and one that suddenly becomes obvious can be a single object nobody has found yet. a shoe beneath leaves, a watch in a drainage, a camera card, a buckle, a phone under ferns. If Cian McLaughlin's red iPhone appeared tomorrow near an old search route, its location alone could redraw years of assumptions. A photograph on Matthew Green's camera could identify a mountain nobody knew he intended to climb. A later timestamp on Chris Fowler's phone could push his final route miles beyond White Pass. Brandon Swanson's handset, even with no usable data left inside it, could transform 47 minutes of guesses about water, fences, and lights into actual geography. Until something like that appears, the maps remain provisional. By the time investigators open a missing person's digital record, the important event has usually already happened. They are moving backward through a life that was moving forward. A routine call becomes ominous because there is no next call. A tower contact becomes crucial because the device never gives rescuers anything better. A complaint about a failing charger turns frightening only because its owner never returns to make it ordinary again. The machines know none of this while it happens. A tower handles a connection, a phone stores a route, a server records a timestamp, a handset accepts a message, even when the network cannot deliver it. A device can stop beside an abandoned mine, reconnect after sunrise, or lie unnoticed beneath vegetation for years, without marking any of those events as important. Only later does the record acquire meaning. A last signal feels different from simple silence. Silence leaves an empty map. A signal gives the mind an edge to continue from. The final contact, the last location record, the last voice. Once that edge exists, we almost automatically imagine the next movement. But the next movement is exactly what the evidence does not contain. Recovered cases show how quickly that blank space can collapse. A body appears near old search tracks. A phone turns up inside ground already covered. A journal explains weeks that had looked completely empty from the outside. What seemed impossible becomes painfully ordinary in a single afternoon. The still open cases have not reached that afternoon yet. An accident may fit. Foul play may fit. In a few of them, the missing space has attracted explanations far stranger than either. None becomes an ending simply because it is easy to picture. And the blank space is getting smaller. Satellite communication, better watches, emergency location systems, drones, and image analysis will keep shrinking it. More people will be found because of those tools. Smaller does not mean gone. Somewhere tonight, millions of phones will touch towers without their owners noticing. Watches will record steps. Navigation applications will store locations. Satellites will pass overhead, and almost every one of those traces will mean nothing tomorrow. One of them will matter. A device will connect for the final time before somebody fails to come home. Nobody watching the network will know the timestamp matters. The person may be walking normally, checking a map, taking a photograph, following lights in the distance, or already moving the wrong way without realizing it. The network will store the event and continue. Hours later, a family may start calling. A car may be found. Search teams may arrive. Investigators will open the record and discover that one ordinary event was the last hard proof they have. They will put it on a map, perhaps as a point, perhaps only a sector, a circle, a final message, or a line that ends in the middle of nowhere. People will walk toward it. Dogs will search, aircraft will fly, and drones will scan. Someone may eventually say the area has been covered, and someone else will go back anyway. The signal may save a life. Searchers may find only the phone. Years later, another hiker may cross ground searched before and notice the one object everybody missed, or the point may remain on the map while every explanation around it grows stranger, because the last ping is not necessarily the place where a person vanished. It is the place where our ability to follow them vanished. The machine can tell us that the device was still connected to our world. It cannot tell us what happened one moment later.